Thanks, Jonathan. So yeah, as I say, we've got a couple of presentations this morning. The first of these is going to be a bit of background to bumblebees, about their ecology, what they do on a day-to-day basis, and how we can get involved with surveying them, particularly through the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. Then we'll have a bit of time for some questions after that. Then we'll have a break for coffee, because I'll need to stop talking for a bit at that point. And then we'll go into the second presentation and cover the really basics of bumblebee identification, how to make sure that what you've got is actually a bumblebee, and then going on to focus on species level ID of the big eight, the common abundant species, the ones that will make up the vast majority of the sightings, basically what you'll actually see on a day-to-day basis. So I will share my screen, just make sure that's working. That should be coming through now, hopefully. Just rearrange it so I can still see you. There we go. Okay, so to start with, bees in Britain are a lot more complex than most people give them credit for. There's an awful lot of stuff in the media about bees which talks about the honeybee as if it's the only bee, or just talk about bees as if it means honeybees. In actual fact, there are between 270 and 280 different bee species native to or resident in Britain. That number does fluctuate because we're still realizing that we've got some species that we didn't know about before, particularly once you start looking at the genetics of different populations. But we have also lost 20 or so species over the last 100 or 200 years. So that number fluctuates, but I think the latest accurate number is something like 276 known confirmed species. One of those is the honeybee. This is the one that gets all the press because it's looked after by beekeepers and it lives in hives and that kind of thing, and it's the only one that makes honey. 24 of them are bumblebees. They're the ones that we're going to focus on today and that I focus on as part of the organization. 18 of them are what you think of as normal bumblebees. They make nests, they have workers, that sort of thing. The other 6 are cuckoo bumblebees, which are parasitic on them, and I'll talk a little bit more about those after the break. And all of the rest are what we call solitary bees. And this is not because they never meet another bee. They can live in great big aggregations with hundreds or thousands of individuals, but every female bee makes her own nest. So she looks after her own offspring. They don't have the social colony system that bumblebees and honeybees and wasps and that kind of thing have. And they have a huge range of really interesting life history strategies and come in a whole range of shapes and sizes. This one in the middle here is Osmia bicolor. You can see it's riding a broomstick here, and they actually nest in snail shells and then cover that snail shell with bits of stick and bits of old grass and that kind of thing. And this is it flying a stick back to that snail shell in order to build this little wigwam over the top of it. But unfortunately, there isn't enough time this morning to talk about them in anywhere near the detail that they deserve. So we're going to focus on bumblebees for the rest of this morning. I normally say we'll only come back to those if we find anything interesting in the field session, but of course we haven't got a field session today, unfortunately, so you'll have to look out for them yourselves. So bumblebees, wherever you are in the world, bumblebees are likely to be around, and wherever you are, they're in the same genus. So it's a really quite close-knit family relationship. Same sort of level of closeness as between dogs and wolves and coyotes and that kind of thing. And worldwide, there's between about 250 to 270 different species. So we've actually got 10% of the world's species in Britain, which is pretty good going for a small, damp North Atlantic island. Normally, with most insect groups in particular, they like it warm. So if you go down to tropical countries, you can have huge numbers of species. And if you go down to look at butterflies in places like Brazil, there can be 4, 5, 6,000 species of butterfly. Then you come up to Britain and the diversity gets less and less until we have 55 breeding species of butterfly. Bumblebees really buck that trend. And because of that, because they don't like living in the tropics particularly, they like the temperate zones, it means that conserving them in Britain and in temperate Europe is frankly far more important when you look at the global status of these groups than it is for a lot of other animal groups. So if we don't get it right, it's quite important. which is why we spend an awful lot of time trying to get it right. They have an annual life cycle, so all of the bumblebees that you'll see out and about now are likely to be, by this stage, workers. They will have come out in the last couple of weeks or so and have a fairly short lifespan, but the queens will overwinter. Queens will set up a colony in the spring and then start producing all these vast numbers of extra bumblebees. So it's not that every individual you see has managed to overwinter, except as an egg. Most of them, as I mentioned, are social bumblebees. They live in nests, they pollinate flowers, that kind of thing. The others, and it's, as I say, 6 in Britain out of 24, relatively similar proportions around the world, are parasitic bumblebees, which are basically, they come in and they take over the nests. And as I say, I'll talk a little bit more about those later. But whether they're parasitic or social, bumblebees feed exclusively on pollen and nectar from flowers. So they are really susceptible to changes in environmental condition, which just mean there are fewer flowers around. They are far less resilient in some ways than things like butterflies and moths, where the eating life stages, the caterpillars, feed on leaves, because leaves tend to persist far more than flowers do. And because of this, they're adapted for efficient collection. You can see her pollen basket here is outlined in red. The actual leg itself is flattened, so that it's got this nice flat space here, which is completely hairless. You can almost see the reflection in it. It's basically acting as a teaspoon for the bumblebee to collect that pollen and nectar into. It mixes a little bit of nectar in with the pollen until it's about the consistency of plasticine, and then you get a big blob of it stuck on the hind leg there. You may just about be able to make out the little fringing hairs on either side, which form the sides of that basket. So it's this sort of shape, and it can actually hold quite a lot of pollen, and you'll see very heavily laden bumblebee workers flying around at the moment, hopefully today. What you can't see is the adaptation for collecting nectar. And actually in the front half of the abdomen here, internally, is a great big sort of pre-stomach, a great big bag, which is the nectar or honey stomach. And it drinks all the nectar, goes through the head into the thorax and collects up in here. And is very slightly dehydrated. They don't turn it into honey, they don't dehydrate it that much, but they take about 2% of the water out of it, which goes into the bee and enables it to work. And that comes out as slightly more gloopy nectar, which is stored in the nest. And they only have about enough stored in the nest for about 3 days of poor weather. So it's not a huge amount at all. And it's not honey, it's not thick and viscous enough to be honey, because bumblebee nests don't survive the winter. But they do have a little bit of store in there. And so the workers in particular are adapted to carrying that back to the nest and either storing it or feeding it straight to larvae. And as I said, they are cold adapted. They almost blur the line between warm-blooded animals and cold-blooded animals, which is why they live predominantly in the northern hemisphere. If we look at an infrared picture of a bumblebee warming up on a cool morning, you can see the lighter the colours here, the warmer it is. So the outside air temperature is low 20s, 22 or so. The ground down here is much cooler. The lowest temperature is 16.8 in that image. But the bee itself is much, much warmer than the outside air temperature. And that's because bumblebees aren't smooth and sleek and aerodynamic. They have to bludgeon their way through the air. If we look at the X-ray over here, you can see these great big bands of muscle in the thorax. Those are the flight muscles, essentially. And it takes a huge amount of power and muscle effort to get the bee into the air. They flap their wings something like 2,500 times a minute. That generates an awful lot of heat. And you can see that heat in the thorax here. It's 35 degrees or so in the bee's thorax at the moment, which means it's warm enough for the bee to be able to take off. They actually need an internal thorax temperature of about 30 degrees Celsius or plus, just in order to be able to flap those wing muscles frequently enough and to generate enough power that the bee can actually take off. But you can actually see that the back end of the bee here, the abdomen, is a completely different temperature, because one of their other adaptations, which is quite clever, is that they have basically the blood vessels going between the thorax and the abdomen can be turned on or off. And so if the bee is trying to warm up, it doesn't want to heat the entire bee up. It wants to heat up these wing muscles in here. So it turns off the blood supply to the abdomen all the way down this back here. And so the abdomen itself stays relatively cool. The warm blood circulates in the thorax. It heats up quicker and the bee can fly off as quickly as possible. If it's a really hot day, then they can increase the blood flow to the abdomen. The abdomen itself would be the same temperature, if not slightly warmer than the thorax, and the bee can radiate that heat, which means they can fly on warmer days. They generate an awful lot of heat, but they only have a fairly narrow window where they can actually fly when the body temperature is between roughly about 30 and 40 degrees Celsius. So when the outside air temperature is above 30 degrees or so, they really struggle to vent that heat quickly enough. So they struggle to fly on really warm days, which is why around midday on the really hot days that we've had over the last couple of years, you won't actually have seen many bumblebees because they just can't fly. Flying generates so much heat that they can't vent it quickly enough. But it does mean that they're very well adapted to being able to fly in cold conditions. They don't need to bask in sunshine like butterflies and reptiles and that kind of thing. So they can come out early in the year, they can fly early in the morning, late at night, and they can fly right the way through into the autumn. So bumblebees are really important pollinators, as hopefully we all know, but that's particularly true for early season flowers. And for things like bluebells in woodland, queen bumblebees are a really major pollinator source because they're the main pollinator group that can be counted on to be around at that time of year, almost regardless of the weather. So they do need an awful lot of energy in order to be able to do that. Luckily, nectar is a really high energy food, but it just means they need a lot of it. And so if an area doesn't have enough flowers, it will struggle to support bumblebees sufficiently. The bumblebee life cycle, as I mentioned, is annual. So over the winter months, this is a queen bumblebee tucked up in her little hibernaculum, this little cell in here. You can find them in old log piles, underneath stones, underneath moss at the bottom of trees, that kind of thing, or as here in a plant pot, where they can dig down and find themselves somewhere which is fairly dry, fairly stable temperature, fairly cool all winter, and ideally that won't start to warm up until spring is properly here. They don't want to wake up on the first sunny day in January, for instance, and then get snowed on the next day. But equally, they don't want to be flooded out or whatever. So generally, you'll find them relatively high up on the north side of banks and that kind of thing. That's the classic overwintering bumblebee location. But pot plants and that kind of thing are quite valuable for them as well. And then in spring, once that spring weather finally does arrive, which I'm sure was a bit of a struggle for them this year, as it was for all of us, the queens will come out and their first job is to find food. They haven't eaten for 6 or 8 months at this point, so they spend an awful lot of time looking for nectar in particular. They don't need pollen until they've actually got grubs to feed. So things like willow catkins, as we've got here, are really, really good nectar sources for them in the early spring. Each of these catkins is a whole load of flowers stuck together. By the time you've got a 20-foot tree, that's an awful lot of nectar. And if you stand underneath a tree like that on a warm day in spring, or underneath blackthorn or other similar flowering plants, you will hear it absolutely hum with the queen bumblebees fueling up for the summer. Once they've done that, then they start finding a nest site. Different bumblebee species have slightly different requirements. A lot of species, like the buff-tailed bumblebee, will nest underground in old rodent burrows and vole holes and that kind of thing. Other species, the carder bumblebees in particular, will nest on the ground surface at the bottom of grass tussocks and similar places. The tree bumblebee, as the name suggests, nests in tree holes, and artificial tree holes like people's roofs or bird boxes are ideal for it. And so you'll see for a couple of weeks or so, big hefty queen bumblebees doing sort of zigzag flights, low down, landing, investigating holes in the ground and that kind of thing. You may see them going in and out of your bird houses or whatever. And that's basically checking them out, looking to see if there's a suitable nest site. We don't have a massively good handle on what makes an ideal bumblebee nest site, but they do tend to like dappled shade, southwest or southeast facing. They don't want somewhere that will get too hot by midsummer, but we don't know quite how they tell that in early spring. They're quite clever. This over here is a top-down view of an established bumblebee nest. So bumblebees make all these little pots out of wax secreted between the plates of the abdomen. They will lay eggs. The queen bumblebees will lay eggs, and these little grains of rice here are bumblebee eggs, tiny, tiny little lozenge-shaped things. And then these little white C-shaped grubs here are the bumblebee larvae. Bumblebees actually have the same sort of four-stage life cycle as butterflies and moths. These grubs are the equivalent of the caterpillar stage, if you like, but all of the juvenile stages, the eggs, the larvae, the pupae, which are inside some of these sealed up pots here, all of those juvenile stages only happen in the nest. So you don't see them in the way that you do, for example, with caterpillars. You'll only see the adult bumblebees outside the nest. This is a worker bumblebee. That's what these grubs will turn into. The queen will lay a whole load of 12 or so eggs at first onto a big blob of pollen and nectar that she's collected. They will eat their way through it. The queen will go in and out, resupplying them, bringing in more pollen, more nectar for them, until eventually the worker bumblebees mature and they take over that foraging role. Basically, foraging is dangerous. The queen is the only reproductive individual in that nest at that point because all the workers are sterile. So essentially, they are expendable, for want of a better term. They go out and do the dangerous job. The queen, after that point, stays inside the nest, looks after the offspring, regulates the feeding, lays more eggs, repeats basically for a couple of months until the nest is big enough and strong enough and has enough food that it can start to produce the new reproductive individuals. And the queen will start to lay eggs, which are then given an awful lot more food. So she changes the regulation of the food, and a reasonable number of developing larvae get about 3 times as much food as the normal larvae do, and they turn into queens with working reproductive systems. And she will also lay a batch or so of unfertilized eggs. She can actually choose whether or not to fertilize the eggs, because bumblebees have a weird sex determination system whereby unfertilized eggs turn into male bumblebees, fertilized eggs turn into female bumblebees. All of the workers are female, all of the queens are female, and she just lays a batch of unfertilized eggs to turn into males. Males will go off and try and find new queens to mate with. The new queens will go off, try and find someone to mate with themselves, and then go back into the colony, top themselves off with nectar from the stores, and then go off and find their own hibernation site, where the old queen, the workers, and the males will gradually die off through the autumn, and only the new queens will survive into the following year. And that is a slightly finely balanced system, as you can probably understand, and that hasn't necessarily worked out hugely well for bumblebees over the last couple of 100 years or so. The first real bumblebee Bible came out in 1912, written by a guy called Sladen, who was based down in Kent and did quite a lot of bumblebee study, including going out and finding queen bumblebees with his local ditch diggers over the winter, bringing them back and rearing them on in his shed and that kind of thing. And a huge amount of what we actually know about the nesting biology of bumblebees comes from him. But round about the middle of the 20th century, 1960s, 1970s, people started to realize that what they were finding when they were going out and looking for bumblebees really didn't match what Sladen had been writing about 50, 60, 70 years before. And so in the mid-1970s, fieldwork started for an atlas, distribution atlas of bumblebees. That was published in 1980 and found really, really widespread declines across the bumblebee group from the time that Sladen was writing about until the 1980 atlas came out. They looked particularly at the social bumblebees. The parasitic species, the cuckoo bumblebees, had been hived off as a slightly separate group at that point. And they found that of the 19 or so social bumblebees that we had at that point, in fact, I think they looked at 20, 7 of them, almost a third, had declined by more than 70% over that 80-year period. We had actually lost one species in that period, Bombus cullermanus, Cullerman's bumblebee, was last seen on the Berkshire Downs in 1941. And at that point, although they didn't know it, we were about to lose a second species. The short-haired bumblebee, Bombus subterraneus, was last recorded at Dungeness in Kent in 1988 and hasn't been seen since. They're both now thought to be extinct in Britain. And 8 species, so 7 different plus the reintroduced population of the short-haired bumblebee, 8 out of our 24 or 25 species are now rare enough for even the government to recognise that they are conservation priority species, which is a really, really high proportion for the group, and obviously a really, really important group not to lose. And unfortunately, the real poster child for these kind of declines is the great yellow bumblebee, Bombus distinguendus. This is a really impressive species of bumblebee. It's big, it's similar sort of size to the buff-tailed bumblebee, but this bright golden yellow all over, apart from this black band between the wing bases. I've been up to northern Scotland to see these guys, and the general effect when you see them being blown around in the wind up on Orkney is like being pelted by big hairy tennis balls. It's a really, really striking species. You know it if you see it. There's nothing that you can confuse it with. And if we go back 100 years, it's pretty widespread. You've got a pretty fair chance of seeing it wherever you are in the country, bearing in mind how few people were out surveying bumblebees in the first half of the 20th century with the Great Depression and 2 world wars and no system for collating records. It's a pretty fair bet that it was pretty much everywhere, not necessarily the most abundant species at all, but pretty widespread, and you've got a good chance of seeing it almost wherever you are. If we fast forward to the second half of the 20th century, there are 9 English records in the whole of that 50-year period. There are 2 Welsh records, plus that one on the Isle of Man. Bearing in mind the surveying for the 1980 Atlas, 20 years of surveying for biodiversity action plans and that sort of thing, 25 years of the Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society devoted to trying to find it amongst other species. There's a huge amount more survey pressure going in. There's a huge amount more effort to record sightings, and it's still really, really on the edge at this point, as you can see. And if we look at the 21st century, the last 20 years, it's extinct in England. It is extinct in Wales. There are no sightings in either of those countries since the early 1960s, I think, pretty much. Even these hotspots right up in the far north of Scotland, you can see are much, much smaller and less well connected than they were 100 years ago, despite the fact that there is an awful lot more survey pressure going on looking for them. We have people up there working on it. There are an awful lot of volunteers in Monitor up there and other organisations. But this is a species which, at heart, is almost subarctic. It would really like to be up around the top of that slide, and that's where you find it still doing reasonably well in Scandinavia. It likes it cold and damp, basically, which is why it used to do really quite well in Britain. The habitat has probably changed slightly for the worse over that 100, 150 year period, but not enough to get rid of the bee across the extent that we've lost it from, because what really has been lost as far as the bumblebee is concerned is the quality of habitat across that wider countryside and the connectivity of that habitat. It's all very well having 1 or 2 hay meadows here and there, which may be able to survive, nest may be able to survive in, but because each bumblebee nest only has 1 reproductive individual, the queen, you need a lot of nests, 30 to 50 nests in a population, all interacting with each other, mating with each other, in order to have that genetic basis for continuity of that particular population. And you can see even on places like Salisbury Plain, biggest extent of semi-natural grassland in Western Europe, it's not enough to sustain the population of this species. We've lost it from the plain, and we're still losing other species from there that are sensitive to that level of habitat connectivity and disturbance. So unfortunately, that delicate balance between habitat suitability and climate suitability has been upset for this species. We've lost the habitat, except on the Macar grasslands up in the far north and west of Scotland. It seems to be doing quite well in those areas where there is the habitat for it, But of course, because it now basically lives in sand dunes, it's really at risk for things like sea level change, and just one bad winter storm could do an awful lot of damage to things like these populations on the Outer Hebrides. So this is a species which, to a certain extent, is living on borrowed time at the moment, and it wouldn't be at all surprising if we lost it as a breeding species in Britain in the relatively near future. So why are bumblebees declining in general, moving away from the great yellow as a specific example? Again, there's an awful lot of stuff in the press about pesticides, and there was a huge furore earlier this year when it was possible that some neonics were going to be brought back for use on sugar beet in East Anglia. That certainly doesn't help bumblebees. Insecticides don't help bumblebees in general, but the real problem that bumblebees have is that loss of habitat. There's the statistic floating around about 98% of flower-rich grassland has been lost in the UK. That is actually a massive underestimate, because that was a survey done between 1934 and 1984. That 1984 is 36 years ago now, and those 36 years we have lost an awful lot more of that flower-rich grassland, either through digging it up or putting roads through it, or just in degradation. So it may still be grassland, but it's not now in many cases flower rich because of increased nitrogen deposition and that kind of thing, fertilization. This really nice bumblebee friendly wildflower meadow sort of approach is reliant on really low soil fertility. We have an awful lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere from car exhaust and that kind of thing, which then gets deposited in rain, produces basically a diffuse fertilizer across this whole area. And you start to get coarse grasses dominating, you start to lose the floristic diversity, and that means that you start to lose the things like bumblebees that are reliant on that. So this 98% is probably more like 99 point something % of the flower-rich grassland has been lost, and much of the remainder is in small isolated patches. As I say, if the bumblebees can't get between those patches, and if there isn't enough within a bumblebee's flight range to sustain that nest, then that bumblebee is not going to be around for a huge amount of time. And increasingly, as agriculture changed through the 20th century, this became far more normal. This is a cereal crop, so there's no actual flowers there for bumblebees, but equally you can see it's now a massive field. There's no hedgerows for the bumblebees to nest in or to provide early nectar through having blackthorn in it or whatever. Increasingly, hay meadows have been replaced by cutting for silage multiple times a year, an awful lot more inputs and those sort of systems in terms of fertilizer and that kind of thing. So generally, the countryside is now far less bumblebee friendly than it was 100, 150 years ago. It's very easy to blame farmers for this, but they need to make a living, and the system that is in place, particularly with the supermarkets and the amount of money that they actually pay for anything to the producers, means that production has had to be streamlined and intensified, and wildlife in general has been squeezed out by that process across most of Britain's farmland, and bumblebees are particularly vulnerable to that because they need the flowers, they need that connectivity in a way that most other species don't. You can have individual plants hanging on and that species is still around. You can have vegetative patches of things like trefoils, and that will be enough for butterflies, even the rare species. But bumblebees need well-managed areas with flowers or plants that are allowed to come up and flower, and that continuity of flowers right the way through from February, March sort of time when the queens are coming out of hibernation, right the way through to September, October sort of time when the new queens and new males are being produced. And that we just don't have across most of Britain at the moment. It's something that people are working to put back. We do a huge amount of work with farmers, with other landowners, with the general public to try and put that back, and there are successes in there. We do have species which are increasing because of that, but overall it's not a particularly pretty picture for bumblebees. And to be honest, when you look at the data of wildlife conservation, you can say pretty much the same thing for most of the groups that we monitor. So farmland birds, wetland birds, seabirds, ladybirds, ground beetles, butterflies, a lot of moth species, all seem to be declining when you look at them at the group level. Individual species will buck that trend or do worse than that trend, but broadly speaking, wildlife is in decline. The great advantage for bumblebees is that we get something from them. It's very difficult to make people care about something which just sits in the countryside and doesn't do anything as far as they're concerned. It's far easier to enthuse people about something that makes food for us. People can, even governments can understand that that is something that you don't want to lose necessarily. And so we know that bumblebees are a major part of that insect pollinator guild, all of the pollinating insects put together, and that insect pollination in the UK alone is worth more than £500 million a year. The number fluctuates from year to year, but the most recent calculation was this 603 million a year. 75% of the species that we grow as crops need pollination in order to produce a crop. So the big field crops, the cereals, don't, but any of the fruit and the veg and that kind of thing basically do. So as we've got pictures here, cherries, apples, strawberries, various berries here, all of those, if you don't have pollination going in the crop, you either don't get any crop at all. Things like apples need pollination in order to produce fruit, or you get a smaller crop or a less lower quality crop overall. So things like oilseed rape, there are various wind pollinated variants and that kind of thing, but if you have insect pollinators in that crop, you get a higher quality crop at the end of it, and you get more crop at the end of it. So insect pollinators are still adding value there, even though they aren't solely responsible for it. If we scale that up, the most recent estimates, which are now slightly old, are that insect pollinators provide about 14.2 billion euros across the EU, and up to about 265 billion euros worldwide, which are not small numbers. And people have also estimated what we might have to do if we lost insect pollinators or lost them to a level at which we were starting to suffer the consequences. And a really conservative estimate from a study done almost 10 years ago now, so this is a number which will have increased, is that to replace what we currently get for free from pollinators would cost around £1.8 billion per year. So that would basically be an army of people with little paintbrushes or cigarette ends dabbing pollen from one flower to the next across all of your orchards, all of your flowering crops. We just don't have the money, we don't have the people who'd want to do it. So the price of things like apples and strawberries and all these obligate pollinator food species would have to go up by 2, 3, 4 times for it to be worth anyone's while to grow the things, which is going to make obviously massive differences to what people can afford to eat and to the human nutrition and diet more widely. But whilst people are working on techno fixes and potential ways out of that problem, you'll see occasionally pollinator drones and that kind of thing getting flagged up. That only covers a tiny fraction of the plant species that actually grow in the countryside. They are the ones that obviously we grow ourselves. But when you look more widely, you look at the wider countryside, you look at gardens, there are about 9,000 wild or crop or garden flowering plants across Britain. 90% of those wildflowers or of those flowering plants are dependent on insects for pollination at some level at least. And whilst people may invent pollinating robots or may go and pay to have hand pollinated in the apple orchards or whatever, no one is going to do that in your garden. No one is going to go and hand pollinate the wildflowers at the bottom of the hedge down the lane. It's just not going to happen. And so if we don't have wild insect pollinators, then we won't have the countryside or the gardens in anywhere near the same way that we do now. And bumblebees are real supporters of these sort of semi-natural flower-rich grasslands, but also of other wildflower and flower-rich habitats, so hedgerows and woodland edge and that kind of thing have an awful lot of flowering plants in. And if we don't have those being pollinated, you won't get new plants. Obviously, depending on whether they're annuals or whatever, you'll get them changing at different rates. But ultimately, if you don't have pollination, you won't be getting new plants, and that will be a problem in time, whatever the plant is, even if it's a tree. And people talk about honeybees as a potential solution to this, and DEFRA, for example, are very pleased to have hives on top of Noble House in London. But honeybees are one species. Although you get different names for Italian honeybees and black British bees and that sort of thing, they're all the same species. They just vary a little bit in colour and where the genetics originated from. And because of that, honeybees all have the same sort of length of tongue. It's about 6.5 millimeters long. And that means that honeybees will only visit a small proportion of flowers, those flowers that they can actually get pollen or nectar out of. So if you want to grow big, open, flat flowers like poppies or daisies or whatever, then that's fine. The honeybees will quite happily be able to visit and pollinate your flowers. If you want to grow something with a slightly more complex flower, or has a different flowering need, so you want to grow broad beans, we've got here, or foxgloves, nasturtiums, those sort of things, honeybees just won't visit them because they can't actually reach the pollen or the nectar in order to actually get anything out of that visit, so they won't do it. So if you want to have this broad, diverse array of plants, you need a broad, diverse array of pollinators in order to pollinate them, in order to maintain them as a population. And additionally, honeybees are very, very efficient at collecting pollen, which means on a per bee basis, they don't actually do an awful lot of pollination. You can see both of these pictures of honeybees here. The pollen is very neatly blobbed onto the hind leg here. They have a similar sort of pollen basket structure as bumblebees. There's very little, if any, pollen on the rest of the bee. Compare that to the bumblebee up here. You can see he is much less efficient at collecting pollen, which from the plant's point of view is ideal, because as soon as this lands on the next flower, half of this pollen will fall off, and that's the pollen which actually does the fertilization. That is the actual pollination process as far as the plant is concerned. The honeybees are just stealing the pollen and nectar and taking it to make into more honeybees. The bumblebees are much less efficient. They're still quite good at collecting it, but they do have a little bit more that falls off them. And so when people have studied pollination in apple orchards, they've found that on a per bee basis, bumblebees are 12 times more efficient at actually doing pollination than the honeybees are, because as you can see, the pollen is just all over it and that wipes off as soon as it lands on the next flower. What they did find though, a reaffirmation of the value of having multiple pollinators, is that if you have solitary bees, particularly they looked at Osmia bicolor, the red mason bee, because they collect the pollen dry in a brush under the abdomen, they found that those individual red mason bees were 300 times better at pollination on a per bee basis than were honeybees. Obviously, again, all of this pollen is ready to go, ready to drop off, and they actually wipe the back end over the relevant bits of the flower when they land on it. So they do an awful lot more pollination in the wild bees than they do in the honeybees. So honeybees, fine, worth keeping them. You get honey, obviously, and they do some pollination, but they aren't a solution to the pollinator crisis on their own at all. And so we wanted to know a little bit more when the trust was first set up back in 2006 about what's actually going on now with bumblebees. We know from these long-term, large-scale data sets what's going on at the broad scale, those kind of distribution maps that I showed you for the Great Yellow. We wanted to know a little bit more up to date. So we know that the common species were everywhere. We do have those fairly reasonable distribution records. So we know where they are now-ish and where they were historically. But what we didn't know very much about was abundance. Now, abundance is really important. Obviously, that tells you how healthy an actual population is. And you can calculate trends in that in order to be able to know what's going on before it's too late, before you've lost that population. If you have a big population with hundreds of individuals, that gradually declines to tens of individuals, to ones of individuals, and then they're gone. That becomes apparent well before you get to the stage where they're gone. You can calculate that trend. You can realize which species which sites, which habitats are doing well, which are doing poorly. From that, you can work out things like, is this site well managed? Is this conservation work working in the way that we want it to? Or do we need to change things? Do we need to change the management of this site because it's clearly not working? And what is the overall state of bumblebees in Britain now? And so to get that early warning of what kind of population losses, what kind of species to focus on, what's actually going on, we need to know a lot more about abundance than we did 10 or 15 years ago. The large scale maps are great, but they largely tell you when it's too late to do anything. It's obviously conservation measures for the great yellow in England are currently pointless because there's no way for it to reach them, for it to get to those sort of habitat areas. So one of the first things, and actually our longest running project now, was a bumblebee monitoring scheme called Bee Walk. Now, this is set up based on the butterfly monitoring scheme. The idea is that volunteers walk a set route, a transect, at least once a month between March, as the bees are coming out of hibernation, right the way through to October, as the bees are finishing for the year. It doesn't really matter how long it is. We recommend it's about a mile long, 1 to 2 kilometres, because in midsummer that can take about an hour by the time there's a lot of bumblebees to identify. And we ask that people identify the bees to species as far as possible. We have unknown bumblebees as a species if you aren't quite sure. And crucially, count how many of each species they actually see. So this is one of my old transects when I lived in Oxfordshire. So you can see you just go out, walk this same route month after month and count how many bees of each species you see on each section and put the data into the website. And from that, we can run a whole load of statistics on it and really get a picture of what's actually going on for bumblebees across the country. And in due course, as we get more and more data, we can start to look at smaller sections of that. We can look at regions, we can look at habitats and that kind of thing. And this is the only national scheme for abundance of a major pollinator group. There are equivalent schemes for butterflies and moths, but they don't actually do an awful lot of pollination. This is the only way that we have of detecting these population level changes over time, whether that is declines or increases, and thus of getting that early warning of potential population losses and potential species losses, of working out, as I say, when we need to act, how we need to act, and what species we need to act on. So it's really quite important. The aims of Bee Walk, I'm going to go over it in a little bit more detail now, because one of my main reasons for being here is to sort of brainwash as many of you as possible into becoming bee walkers for us. So the aims are to gather both abundance and distribution data for all of the UK's bumblebee species, to analyse that data and to be able to report trends in bumblebee populations over time, as I say, whether that's positive or negative, and to drill down to investigate the causes of these changing trends in bumblebee populations, and how much of that is habitat change, how much of that is climate change, as that becomes a bigger issue for bumblebees. And as I say, particularly with increasing species, what's actually working in terms of habitat. So how to set up a transect. The idea is that you choose the site location. Obviously, we don't know your local area anywhere near as well as you do. So it needs to be somewhere which is convenient and accessible for you to be able to do it, so that life doesn't get in the way too much once it's up and running. As I say, 1 to 2 kilometres long, about a mile is our general recommendation. As long as it's more than about 100 metres, it can be any length. We do have people who've got 7 or 8 kilometre transects, but in midsummer, it does take them a very long time, and most people don't have an entire afternoon to go off and do this on a monthly basis. And it should be split into sections based on habitat, because different habitats have different bumblebees and affect things in different ways. And it is just really quite basic habitat gradations. So this is the Morgan Hills near me. So this would be one section as you walked along here. And then as soon as you drop down the side into the woodland, that would be a second section because the habitat's changed. And you draw it out on the website. So give it a name. do make sure that is a name which is sensible and interpretable to people other than yourself. There's a limit, and that's a very low limit on how many transects we can have called My Garden. And it gets very confusing, both for you putting the data in and for me trying to work out where it might actually be, if you call it that. So do try and call it the sort of name that you would find on a map. So in this case, it's Radley Lakes, which is just outside Abingdon in Oxfordshire. Click on the map in order to set the central grid reference. You can switch this using this little cross at the side here to be an aerial photo or an Ordnance Survey map. So you can zoom in and out and that kind of thing, different levels. Tell it what county you're in, how many sections, and then click next. And it will take you to this screen. This is where you can draw out the actual route. So the section that you're about to draw is this funny, muddy, greeny brown color. Click on the map where you start, just click your way along like a sort of join the dots puzzle until you get to the start of the next section. Double click and that will complete that section, and go up, click on that second button and repeat the process. Again, you can switch this between an Ordnance Survey map and an aerial photo. Aerial photo is quite useful because obviously you can see where all these little desire paths are. You can see the hole in the hedge that you go through here. You can see the tree that you finish section 2 next to. You can really see those on the ground details, so it's quite handy. And I should point out that you only need to draw out your transect route once as you start, and then it's just stored on the system and you record sightings against it. So although this is a little bit drawn out, you only need to do it once and then it's done in perpetuity. Once you've drawn out your route, click next, and it will take you to put in a little bit of extra detail about each of the sections. It will automatically calculate the grid reference and section length for you. You don't need to do that. You just need to pick the land use and the habitat. You've got up to 4 habitats and up to 2 land uses, because obviously there's going to be a little bit of variation. If you're walking along a road with a hedge on one side and a grassy bank on the other, you've got a couple of habitats straight off. So the one that you spend the most time walking through, put as your primary, and then in descending order. You don't need to fill in all 4 if it's only one. If you're just walking across a field and it's all the same habitat, just put in 1. If it's more complex, put in more. And then do that for each of the sections, and then you're done. And click save and it's set up. And as I say, you don't then ever need to do that again. You just need to record your sightings against it after that point. When you actually come to walk it, there are a couple more guidelines. It's really key that you walk the same transect each time so that those walks are comparable and you can compare between the months and between the years, and that you walk the transect frequently. So at least once a month between March and October. If you want to walk it more frequently, if it's your weekend dog walk or whatever, then that's great. We're always at home to more data, but at least once a month, please. Obviously, if you don't walk it, we don't know what's there, and it's become slightly difficult to do that analysis. And then weather conditions. Those of you who have come across the equivalent butterfly monitoring scheme will have seen their fairly lengthy paragraph about when conditions are suitable for surveying, which includes temperature and wind speed and how much the trees are moving and that kind of thing. That is basically because butterflies are wusses and they don't go out if the weather is at all manky. Bumblebees do. So our equivalent of that paragraph is if you can look out of the window and you think that you would be okay with going outside, it's not currently hailing, then the bumblebees will be out there. So as long as it's reasonable weather, bumblebees don't do particularly well in windy weather. So if you can avoid that and avoid actual precipitation of any kind, then that's ideal. But generally, if you feel okay about going out, then the bumblebees will be out there. And we do have these environmental details on the field recording form to fill in. So that includes a rough estimate of cloud cover and temperature and that kind of thing. So we can take that into account when we come to do the actual analysis. Once you're out on your transect, try and walk at a reasonably steady pace throughout. It's always really tempting to power walk through the bit that you never see any bumblebees, and then walk really slowly past that big patch of flowers that has always got bumblebees on, except for now. But again, it just biases the numbers slightly. So ideally try and walk at a reasonably steady pace throughout. If you have an awful lot of bumblebees on a bramble patch or whatever, then you can stop and have a look at them and count them. Or if you need to catch a bumblebee and identify it, then that's fine. You can do that. But you stop the count when you stop walking. So if you have stopped to identify a bumblebee and another one flies past in front of you, that one doesn't count because it wasn't there. You wouldn't have seen it if you hadn't stopped walking. So try and use your best judgment. It's inevitably not going to be completely infallible, but do your best ultimately. To standardize a little bit more between of the area surveyed, so between recorders who can identify different bumblebees at different ranges, between habitats where you can see bumblebees a long way in open habitats, not so much in places like woodland, and because different bumblebees can be identified more easily at range, some are more distinctive than others basically, then we ask people to only record the bumblebee seen within a recording box, which is 4 meters wide. You're in the middle of the back of the box, essentially 2 meters either side of you, up to 4 meters in front of you, and between ground level and 2 meters up. So that box in front of you as you walk along, if a bee is in it, if it enters it by flying or it's on a plant and you walk towards it, then that counts. If it's outside it, if the bee is way up here somewhere or it's behind you or it's way off in the distance off to one side or whatever, then it doesn't count in terms of the bee walk survey. You can make a comment, a note about it, but it's not one of the species that you recorded in that box on that survey. Once you actually see a bee, we ask people to record species as far as possible. And the reason that we're coming back after the break is to help you do that. Count them, and ideally, if at all possible, whether it's a queen, a male, or a worker. We'll cover that after the break as well, and it's far more straightforward for some species than others. And so we have unknown species, we have unknown cast for the ones that you just can't tell. And I certainly put things down as unknown from time to time, because if a bumblebee just flies across in front of you, it's very difficult to tell what species it is or anything. Do count honeybees as well. They aren't as good as bumblebees, but we are quite interested in how they co-locate with bumblebees. Do you get an awful lot of honeybees and no bumblebees, or vice versa, and that kind of thing? And as I say, it is worth sometimes having a closer look at some of the bumblebees if you're not quite sure what it is. And again, we'll cover a little bit of that after the break in the ID section. But the two main rules, as far as we're concerned, are be consistent, same route, roughly the same sort of pace, that kind of thing, and do actually send us data. Because until that data is actually on the website, we can't do anything with it. Obviously, you've done the fun bit, you've gone out and looked at bumblebees, but we do need the slightly more dull bit of data entry to happen as well. Otherwise, we can't actually do anything. We do try and provide as much help as possible, because we recognise it is a slightly intensive process. The website, BeeWalk website, has a whole load of information on it. So it's got BeeWalk manual if you need to go back and check how to do any of these things. We've got videos of some of the bits of it. We've got recorded ID training courses and that kind of thing in the past few years, and a whole load of links to ID resources and books and that kind of thing. We also have a surveys officer who's currently Sally, works 3 days a week, and you can get hold of her on that email or that phone number if you have any particular questions, or you get stuck, or something's broken and you can't fix it or whatever. And we also have a BeeWalk mentor scheme, which we're in the process of making slightly more visible on the website. But again, if you get in contact with Sally, she'll be able to put you in touch with your local mentor if we have one for that area. And they are prepared to help you go out and walk your transect with you and that kind of thing, and just do a little bit more mentoring and helping you through that initial process. So overall, BeeWalk been going for, this will be the 13th year. started in 2008 with a couple of scoping years. And as you can see, it's really building into a nice national scale picture now. These are all the squares which have submitted data over the last 6 or 7 years through the website. And the number of records per year, the number of individual bumblebees seen each year have really, really increased. And it is now at a stage where we can do an awful lot with that data. Obviously, the COVID restrictions hit us reasonably hard last year, but despite that, we still had 505 transects walked, down from about 585 the year before, but still quite a national scale picture. 175,000 records submitted last year, over 500,000 individual bees recorded so far. It really is a nice usable data set. We can start to do interesting things with that data. It's now starting to really tell us what's going on with bumblebees at the moment. Now, because this spring has been totally manic for all kinds of reasons, we haven't actually managed to finish processing the 2020 data, but we can look at the data up to the end of 2019. And so this is the kind of thing that we can do with the single species results. This is for the early bumblebee, Bombus praetorum, one of the real spring specialist species. And this is how well it's done each year from 2010, when we start getting usable numbers of data, right the way through to 2019. So we can start to pick out the overall trends. We can see which years were good for it. 2014 in particular was a really, really warm spring. It did really well. The grey cloud here is the level of variation around that, because we've got a lot of sites. So we can see that this is a species which is pretty much flat in terms of the overall population trend. It's not a species to be concerned about, and we can tell, we'll start to tell, that it really likes those nice warm springs, and we can start to drill down a little bit into those causes. We can also look at the phenology of when we're actually seeing this thing within the year. The red here is the average from 2010 to 2018. The blue is the 2019 data. And so we can see that it had quite an early year in 2019, earlier than normal. We had this peak in May rather than June. That corresponds with it doing relatively well. It picked up in 2019. So we can start to think that, well, those early years are clearly going to be quite good for it. We've got this possible second generation here, which is quite interesting, because most bumblebees in Britain only have one generation a year. And normally this one does, clearly, when you look at the average. So we can start to really work out what's going on with these things. And we're working with a couple of academic partners, University of Kent in particular, in trying to extract even more information and colony dynamics and that kind of thing from these kind of data sets. But we can do this for, I think it's about 22 species now. So we can really start to drill down into, at an individual species level, how are bumblebees actually doing in the real world over the last 10 years. And we can look at the same thing for all bumblebees. So we can see that bumblebees as a group are probably slightly up overall, 2010 to 2019, but there is a huge amount of variation on those figures. And we can see that 2014, although it was a really good year for the spring flying species, really wasn't anywhere near so good for bumblebees as a whole. And that's because a lot of bumblebees are much later flying. And we had a slightly cold, wet August then. So it's equalized basically. If you look at the late flying species, they actually don't do so well in 2014. And we can do the same kind of thing with the phenology. We can see that 2019 was an early year in general for the species, even when they're all combined together. We can start to pull out all sorts of information from it, including our overall table of essentially winners and losers. Over here, we have the species which have increased in that 10-year period. And this slightly longer list over here are the species which have declined in terms of abundance. So it's obviously concerning, first of all, that the declining list is longer. The blue species in here are those species of conservation concern that I mentioned earlier. They are the rare species. And so it's really nice to see 3 of those rare species are actually increasing in terms of abundance over that 10-year period, including the 2 highest, most increasing species are 2 really quite rare species. So it's quite pleasing that they seem to be bouncing back. The red species are the cuckoo bumblebees, the parasitic species. And that's slightly concerning. We've got 5 out of 6 species are decreasing. Although it seems slightly counterintuitive to be concerned about the decline of a parasite, because they're so tightly integrated with the host species life cycles, it's likely that the reason that those parasitic species are declining is that there's some mismatch going on between them and the host. There's something going on with the hosts in all likelihood. So that's something that we're trying to keep a bit of an eye on. It's not quite sure whether that's serious or whether it's just that they come out at slightly different times, but it is an indication that something is slightly off in that system somewhere. And then these green species are the common ones that we'll talk about later. And so you can see we've got a bit of a mix and match. We've got 4 or 5 that are increasing, 4 or 5 that are decreasing. There's a couple that flip-flop between either sides of the table year to year. But it really does mean that we can start to look at what's going on with these bumblebees and which are the species that we need to focus on. Obviously, these two, Muscorum and Monticola over here, the bilberry bumblebee and the moss carder, are increasing in terms of our priority because they are already conservation priority species because they've had long-term large-scale distribution declines. And as far as we can tell, they are still declining. So they are particularly at risk, and they are the species that we need to be working with. These species over here, the blue ones, Silvarum rhyderatus humilis, they are rare, but they seem to be increasing in the areas that they are still found, partly because those areas see an awful lot of conservation work focused on those 3 species, partly because of climatic factors, but they are increasing. These ones are still at risk rather more. There is also a slightly easier way to get into pollinator monitoring, and that is to use the flower insect timed count methodology from the pollinator monitoring scheme, which we're part of along with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and various others. The idea of this is that you find a patch of flowers which fits within a 50 centimetre by 50 centimetre quadrat, sit next to that and watch it for 10 minutes and count all of the insects that land on the flowers, not the rest of the plant, just the flowers, during that 10-minute period. They only need to be identified broad group level, so it's sort of butterfly, moth, beetle, that sort of level. You don't need to identify them to species, but the idea is that anyone can do them anywhere and they still contribute useful data, because it means that we can see how well these different groups are doing relative to each other. We have BWalk for detailed bumblebee records. We have equivalent schemes for butterflies and for moths, and maybe 1 or 2 others, depending on how you categorize them. This way, because we know how these broad groups are doing, we can say, well, if bumblebees are doing this well, and there are this many in the fit counts, beetles are doing better or worse than that, and so on. It just lets us connect everything up together whilst being a relatively simple methodology for people to use. You can use them for school groups and volunteer days and that kind of thing. And the idea is that we get an awful lot of records coming in from that, which we can then use to tie everything together. If anyone is interested, we also have a slightly more intensive set of 1 kilometre square surveys. And if you are particularly interested in those, do either email me or go straight to POMS at CEH, but they're fixed locations which aren't necessarily in helpful places because they're standardized, but you can certainly do the fit counts wherever and whenever. That is it for the first presentation. So I don't know if anyone's got any questions. I don't think there's been any in the chat so far. There we go. So this second half of today's meeting is to cover identification. We now know a little bit more about the bees and how to get involved in surveying and monitoring them. And the next step is to be able to know what it is we're actually surveying. So to start with, there are an awful lot of flying buzzy things which look very similar in many cases, And obviously only some of those are bumblebees. And there are an awful lot of things which would really like you to think they're bumblebees as well, and actually try and mimic them. So first of all, to make sure that what you've got is actually a bumblebee. Bumblebees are always furry all over. They're never smooth and sleek. They're always this sort of flying barrel sort of shape. They're big, hefty, chunky things. They aren't, again, slim, slender, wasp waist things. And because of that, they produce quite a loud, but quite a low-pitched buzzing noise, noticeably different to the sort of high-pitched whine you get with hoverflies, and quite obvious, obviously, when you hear it. If what you've got is a female bumblebee, and all of the queens, all of the workers are female, so most of the bumblebees that you see, then they will have pollen baskets, as we've got here. If you're really lucky, they'll have pollen in them, and then it's pretty straightforward because only bumblebees and honeybees carry the pollen in a big sort of plasticine-like blob on the hind leg like this. Other bees will carry pollen, but it will be loose in big long hairbrushes under the abdomen or whatever. It won't be a discrete blob like this on the hind leg. It is important to point out at this point that all of the colours, all of the sort of overall patterns and that sort of thing we're going to talk about are just coloured hair. So this is a band of yellow hair. This is a patch of reddy orangey hair here. These are black hairs. The actual bee underneath, the exoskeleton, is entirely black. It doesn't actually match the same colour. So if you find a bee which has lost all its hair, like this one, which had an altercation with some honeybees, they are completely black all over and just very, very difficult to identify, as well as being quite annoyed. So if you were to shave a bee, it would suddenly become very difficult, if not impossible, to actually identify. Luckily, there aren't too many people shaving bumblebees, as far as I'm aware, but what they do is knock their hairs off. They go in and out of flowers, in and out of the nest hole. They spend quite a lot of time rubbing themselves against things, intentionally or otherwise. So all of these hairs can potentially fall off, particularly in a sort of stripe down the middle of the back, where it rubs the thorax going in and out of flowers and in and out of the nest hole, where the wings meet over the back of the abdomen and again brush those hairs. So do make sure that what you're looking at is actually black hair and not just a gap in the hairs if you're looking for black patches. And just be aware that if you find a bumblebee that's this far gone, it will almost certainly have to go down as unknown bumblebee, unless you get down to the level of taking it back and getting it under the microscope, which is a long way beyond what we're going to talk about today. And so, as I mentioned, there are an awful lot of things out there which really want you to think they're bumblebees. Sometimes it's direct mimicry. These two at the top, the hoverfly over here and the dronefly over here, are mimicking a bumblebee and a honeybee, respectively, because honeybees and bumblebees have stings. They can fight back. If you're a small bird or a small rodent, then you don't want to tangle with a bee. If you are a hoverfly, then you can't fight back. It's a nice easy prey for a bird, and so it's ideal, a nice tasty meal. So they pretend to be honeybees and bumblebees in order to sow that seed of doubt in the mind of anything that was thinking about eating them. Sometimes it can be convergent evolution. The tachinid fly down here, Tachinura cyna, is a big parasitic fly which flies early in the year, March, April sort of time. So it's big and fat and round and hairy for the same reason that bumblebees are big and fat and round and hairy, in order to be able to survive and fly in the cold weather of the early spring. It's not actually anything to do with bumblebees at all. It's actually parasitic on moth caterpillars. And sometimes those reasons are just slightly more nefarious. This is a bee fly, Bombilius major. It is kleptoparasitic in the nests of solitary bees. It drops its egg down the solitary bee nest tunnel, and its larva hatches out and eats all of the pollen that the bees have collected, often eats the larva as well. And so it looks like a generic bee in order to be able to sneak up close to the solitary bee nests. But because it's big and round and fluffy, it looks very much like a bumblebee, except with its big proboscis out the front. So there's a whole load of reasons, but what it ends up being is that there is a great big guild of fluffy flying things which look very much like bumblebees, and we need to be able to pick the actual bumblebees out of that broader mass. If you ask a taxonomist how to do that, how to split the bees from the wannabes, they will tell you things like bees have 2 pairs of wings and flies have 1 pair, which is great if you have a specimen, but very difficult to tell when it's flapping those wings 2,500 times a minute. So the easiest way in the field is to look at the heads. Bumblebees have reasonably sized eyes, but they're in proportion to the rest of the head. They've got these long tubular antennae, long tubular mouth parts, which may or may not be stuck out. It's quite handy when they are like this because it's about to go into a flower, but they're often tucked underneath the bee, under here. But the antennae are always visible and the eyes are always in proportion to the rest of the head. By contrast, the flies are very visual things. They've got these massive eyes which take up almost the entirety of the head. They generally have these funny little stumpy antennae, very slightly in shape, but only in a handful of species are they actually long and tubular. They're mostly these funny little short stumpy bits with a long spike coming off them, the arista. And this funny little sponge-like mouth part underneath, never a long, obvious tube like this. So generally, looking at the head is the easiest way to work out what you've got, whether it's a bumblebee or something else. Once you start getting your eye in it, and it doesn't take a huge amount of time, you can start to pick up other differences in the way that they fly. Hoverflies tend to be much more jerky and sort of clockwork flight patterns. Bumblebees are much more resistant to changing direction. Once they start going in a direction, they tend to stay in that direction. They aren't anywhere near as nimble as the flies, and you can see the actual body is a slightly different shape and that kind of thing. And you'll never see any of the bee mimics carrying pollen on those hind legs, or as you will, obviously, with the actual bees themselves. So it takes a little bit of practice, and you will get your eye in after a bit of time looking at them. But the place to start really in the field is to look at the heads, and particularly whether or not it's all eye or not. Now, one thing that I'm not going to talk about a huge amount today, and one thing that bumblebees are slightly unusual in when it comes to ID, is that size is not a particularly good characteristic. They're obviously slightly weird in this, in that if you have a mystery bird on your bird feeder and it's got a 2-meter wingspan, you can be pretty happy that it's not going to be something like a blue tip. But bumblebees don't work that way. Bumblebees have a huge amount more variation within each species than there is between species, because you have the queens, you have the workers, and you have the males, which are all different sizes. So in this top picture here, this is a queen bumblebee. These are workers, they're her daughters. They're as closely related as you can get, let alone the same species. But you can see that the queen is 3 times the size, is much, much bigger individual. Down here, you can see these two certainly think they're the same species, given what they're trying to do, but the male looks totally different to the female, both in terms of appearance and size. And basically, size in bumblebees comes down much more to larval nutrition and the cast of the resulting adult than it does to the actual species. You do have a range of sort of average sizes for each species. You have slightly smaller species like the early bumblebee, and slightly larger species on average, things like the buff-tailed bumblebee. But even between our largest species and our smallest species, each one has a massive range of overlap. So the queens of the small species are bigger than the workers of the larger species, for instance. So size can tell you what caste you have, whether it's likely to be a queen or a worker or even a male. But what it doesn't tell you very much is about the actual species of the bee that you've got there. So it's not going to be something that we talk about a huge amount today. It's much more based on the patterns of the different species. So queens are the first bees that you'll see in every year. And in a warm year, you'll start seeing them in late February onwards. Years like this one, they're a little bit later. And you'll still see them right the way through until September, October sort of time. They're at their most visible in the spring when they're all coming out of hibernation, looking for nest sites. Then they'll slightly disappear because either they've died or they've founded a nest and now the workers are going in and out rather than the queens. And then they'll pick up a bit in the late summer as you start to get the new queens coming out and looking for mates and that kind of thing. They are the biggest bees that we have. They're some of the biggest insects that we have in Britain actually as well. And they have a suite of particular queen behaviours. So you'll often see them flying slow sort of zigzags low down over the ground, investigating holes, landing, crawling around down holes, coming back out again, investigating the bottom of grass tussocks and that kind of thing. You won't see any of the other casts doing that because that's nest searching behaviour. So if you see a bee which looks as though it's lost a contact lens and is desperately trying to find it, quartering the ground, that will almost certainly be a queen bumblebee, particularly if it's doing it in the spring. Workers are very similar. They are all female, just smaller versions, basically. So when you blow them up to be side by side, there's very little in the way of morphological differences between the queens and the workers. If you look internally, there are differences in obviously the lack of reproductive system and that kind of thing, but basically they are very, very similar in terms of general appearance, with a couple of exceptions. The first of these is the buff-tailed bumblebee. Queen buff-tailed bumblebees do what it says on the tin. They've got a buff-coloured tail, but unfortunately, workers have white tails, which makes them very, very difficult to split in the field from workers of the white-tailed bumblebee, which are the same sort of basic colour pattern with the yellow stripes and the white tail, same sort of size. So by far the best plan with those is to just record them as being buff/white-tailed workers. And there's a separate category on BeeWalk and on iRecord as well for that particular group of workers, because it's just not possible to reliably separate them. People have tried it, even with experts, comparing determinations in the field to the DNA of the actual individuals, and it just didn't work. You can get up to about 70% or so success rate, but it's safest just to record them as the aggregate species. The other one, which causes confusion in a slightly different way, is the early bumblebee. Queens, as we've got over here, have this nice obvious yellow abdominal band, but workers quite often don't show that at all. And so we get a lot of inquiries every year about these small dark bees, which have got a yellow band at the front and a little orangey red tail. And it doesn't match any of the pictures in the book. And that is because most of the pictures on ID charts and that kind of thing show queens, which clearly show these two yellow bands and then the orange tail. And the workers, as I say, lose that band. So hopefully you're now pre-warned that this is likely to be one of the main species that you see, particularly around fruit bushes. They really like raspberries and blackberries and that kind of thing. And they're flying now in decent numbers. Males are the last caste to emerge because they're only produced at the end of each colony cycle. So for the really early species, things like the early bumblebee and even the tree bumblebee, you'll start seeing them now, late May, early June. Most of the other species, you'll have to wait another 4 to 6 weeks, and you won't actually start seeing males until July. And once you get to August, you start seeing lots of them. You can recognize a male bumblebee because it's got these hairy hind legs. Males don't do any foraging. Their only role is to find a new queen and mate with her. So they don't have pollen baskets. They generally have far more pronounced facial hair than the females. You can see this one's got this moustache on the front of the face here. And that facial hair is often yellow, which is really quite handy. 5 of the 8 common species in the males have a yellow face, whereas the females don't. So it's quite handy to be able to tell what caste you're looking at. And the general appearance is a bit more yellow. So we've got extra yellow bands generally, and a lot more scruffy. So they've got longer hair. They're less neat than the females. Because the males don't contribute anything to the ongoing colony, they don't bring back any pollen or nectar, they're not actually allowed back into the nest that they've been produced from. So basically, they need to be able to survive outside the nest. Inside the nest, the temperature is about 30 degrees or so. That's the optimum temperature for the larval development. Obviously, outside the nest, the temperature is a lot cooler. So these guys spend the night outside the nest. They have to be able to be a little bit more insulated, a bit more thermal. So they have this longer hair and slightly scruffier appearance. And the extent of yellow does vary quite a lot, even within an individual species. But generally, if your bee has got a moustache and hairy legs and bed hair, and particularly if it's not doing very much, it's not collecting pollen, it's not doing anything like that, it's just sitting on a flower, it's likely to be a male bumblebee. And you'll see them for the next 3 months, basically. But that extent of yellow variation can be quite significant. So this is what most of the books will tell you a white-tailed bumblebee male looks like, with this yellow moustache that you can see here, yellow bands, bit of extra yellow hair in the middle, white tail. But this is also a white-tailed bumblebee male. Once you start to see the key points, you can see it's still got this yellow moustache, it's still got the white tail, but it's got an awful lot more yellow hair in there because it is a really quite variable species. And that's one of the things that makes male bumblebees often quite difficult to identify. They are just much more variable than the females. That's fine. If you need to put it down as unknown species or whatever and just note that it's a male, then that's still useful information. They are slightly more difficult. I mentioned cuckoo bumblebees a couple of times in the first presentation this morning, and we'll go on a little bit more detail about them now. These guys are descended originally from the same group as our current social bumblebees, which is why they're now lumped back in as bumblebees in genus Bombus. For many years, they were split off as a separate group, but genetics has told us that was wrong. So we have 6 species in Britain. They are all parasitic, each of them on at least one of our 8 common species. They tend to be quite specialized to 1 or at most 2 host species. And what they do is the females emerge from hibernation about 6 or so weeks after the queens of their preferred host species. So you won't see them much before Easter. They tend to appear in sort of mid-April sort of time, almost en masse. They will hang around on flowers, nectaring, building themselves up, but also looking for queens of their preferred host species, which look as though they might have a nest. And once they find a queen who fits that description, then they will trail her back to the nest that she's recently set up. And if they find that she's got one, then they will just hang around outside the outskirts of the nest for a few days at least to try and pick up the scent of that particular species, that particular nest. Bumblebee nests, because they're underground or at the bottom of grass tussocks, are very, very dark. Most of the communication in them is chemical. So once the cuckoo picks up the scent of the nest, then she is essentially indistinguishable as far as the social bumblebees are concerned from something that's supposed to be there. So it gives her the advantage of surprise. She's able to sneak in without arousing too much suspicion. And she will actually basically challenge the host queen for control of that nest. They will almost fight a duel to all intents and purposes. The cuckoos cheat slightly because they've got a longer sting, so they've got better weaponry, and they've also got a thicker exoskeleton, so they've got better armor as well. So they tend to win those duels. They will actually sting the host queen to death. There are various, between the plates of the abdomen or around the neck, there are little weak points in the queen bumblebee's armor, which the cuckoo will generally jab the sting through and actually kill the host queen. Once she's done that, the cuckoo will then go on a bit of a rampage across the brood comb, such as it is, and eat, or at least kill, any eggs that the host queen has recently laid, any really young larvae. But she will leave the existing workers and she will leave any larger larvae because she doesn't have any intention of caring for her offspring. She wants to basically fool the workers of the host nest into doing that for her in the same way as cuckoo birds do. So she will lay her own eggs in that nest. One of their other adaptations is to have ovaries twice the size of a normal bumblebee, so they can lay up to about 30 eggs or so at a time in a day. She'll do that, lay a big batch of eggs, and then leave. That's it as far as she's concerned. That's her job done. And then the workers of the nest don't really know quite what's happened. So they will keep feeding the larvae, keep feeding any eggs that hatch into larvae, which obviously includes the offspring from the cuckoo bumblebee. And in due course, 6 or so weeks later, you'll get a big pulse of cuckoo bumblebees, both males and females, coming out of that nest, going off to repeat the process somewhere else. And that nest will gradually wither away and die, because without a queen, there's no more eggs being laid, there's no more workers coming through, there's no more, no chance of any reproductive individuals and that kind of thing. So that nest was essentially a zombie nest from the moment that the host queen had died. It was just staggering on with the workers until they gradually die off of old age or whatever. So perhaps appropriately, the cuckoo bumblebees tend to have a fairly sort of dark and sinister appearance, slightly piratical. Females of most of the species only have this one sort of well-defined band, this collar band near the head here, and the rest of the bee is quite dark until you get down to the tail. They don't have pollen baskets because they don't collect any pollen or nectar for their offspring. They just forage for themselves, and they don't need to carry anything on the hind legs for that. And they generally have quite dark wing membranes, particularly in the red-tailed cuckoo, Bombus rupestris, which has got almost completely black wings, so almost sort of smoked glass in appearance. But most of the other species are this darker black-brown sort of colour, rather than being the see-through membranes, clear membranes that you expect from bumblebees. So they do look noticeably different. And they generally have this sort of notch, either a sharp V like this or a scalloped flat-bottomed U sort of shape in the top of the tail. The tail extends further up the sides of the abdomen than it does at the top, basically. Whereas in the social bumblebees, it tends to just be a straight line across. So you can usually pick out that it is a cuckoo bumblebee using those, the dark appearance, dark wings, the hairy hind legs and the notched tail. And they also have fairly sparse hairs. You can see much more of the exoskeleton shining through, as you can here, because they're only really about in warmer months. They're only, as I say, coming out in about mid-April. You don't see them much after the end of August, if at all. So they don't need to be as well set up to be insulated as the host social species do. And they're all short-tongued species, so they'll only visit those flat, open flowers. You won't ever see them on foxgloves and that kind of thing. And we have, as I say, 6 species in Britain. One of them has got a red tail, one of them has got a yellow tail, so those two are reasonably straightforward to pick out once you know that it's a cuckoo. We have 2 species which have got a white tail on its own, and 2 species which have got a white tail with these yellow flashes on either side, these sort of saddlebags. So you can generally get it down to be 1 of 2 for those and 1 of 2 for those 2. But actually getting it down to species can be quite tricky within those 2 groups. So we're not going to go into that sort of level of detail because they aren't hugely common. But we are going to focus on species level ID now of the common host, the social species. So we're not going to go into any particularly complex terminology today. Basically, the abdomen, here at the back of the bee, which contains reproductive and digestive stuff, and the sting as part of that in the females. The thorax here, which is where all the wings and the legs are attached, got all the muscles, basically. The antennae here at the front, the sensory apparatus, and the wings and the pollen baskets hopefully are self-explanatory or we've already covered. So once you get your mystery bee, there's a sort of triage process to go through to work out which bits to look at first or to get photographs of first to have the best chance of identifying your mystery bee. We'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail, so don't worry too much about scribbling them down now. Tail colour is the first step. British bumblebees fall quite neatly into 3 tail colour groups: red, white and no obvious tail distinction. Banding, where the yellow bands are, how many there are, whether or not it's got that facial hair, the moustache that the males have that I mentioned, the legs for the pollen baskets in particular, the antennae, and lastly behaviour, which is in brackets because it's indicative rather than being definite, but it can still be quite a useful guide. So tail colour, first of all, as I say, you have basically red-tailed bumblebees, you have white or yellow-tailed bumblebees, and you have the uniform tail bees where the abdomen is all basically the same color and you don't have an obvious tail. That's a really useful first step, but you can also look at the extent and position of that coloration. So this is the early bumblebee queen. This has got an orangey red tail, but it's only this tiny little bit at the end of the abdomen. By contrast, this is the red-tailed bumblebee, Bombus lapidarius, much more obvious, big brick red tail tip there. You can see straight away that there's a difference even before you start looking at the banding patterns and that kind of thing between those two. And then if we add the bilby bumblebee into the equation, almost the entire abdomen is bright red apart from this sort of section or two at the front. So you can actually split those three up. Even though they've all got a red tail, they've got completely different sizes of that tail tip straight away. So you can get a lot of useful information just by looking at the tail. Banding is quite useful, particularly for the white-tailed bumblebees. So how many of these yellow bands has it got and where are they? We generally have the three groups of the one-banded, tend to be cuckoos, just have this one band behind the head. The two-banded species, which have still got this yellow collar band behind the head here, but also have a band across the middle of the abdomen. And we've got a couple of three-banded species as well, which have the same collar band at the front of the thorax behind the head here, but you also have a second band at the back of the thorax and the third band at the very front of the abdomen here. So it looks quite different when you see it in flight, particularly it's to be a very big, thick yellow midriff band because these two bands show together. The male bumblebees do confuse that a little bit because, as we saw, they vary quite a lot in how much yellow there is. And although these two are the same species, they're both male red-tailed bumblebees, Bombus lapidarius, you can see that the diagram shows somewhat less yellow hair than the actual individual here does. So just bear in mind that the strength of the band, if it isn't a particularly strong band, it may not be shown particularly well in some of the illustrations. It's why it's useful to have a range of ID resources. And there are a lot of good online sites which show you a whole range of photos of different species, which is a really useful addition to books and that kind of thing. But as we move down the list, these are becoming less important as we go through. Generally, with the tail color and the banding pattern, you can get to species with most of the bees. Faces is mostly to tell you whether or not you've got a male or a female bumblebee. So whether or not it's got that moustache in the males, because bumblebees do vary in color and in pattern between the males and the females. So knowing if you've got a male or a female of some sort just sends you down the right leg of that ID. It's no good trying to match a whole load of male color patterns against a female bumblebee that you've got and vice versa. So just knowing which one you've got is really quite useful. So it is actually reasonably straightforward in most cases to see whether you've got a black face, as we've got here with the female red-tailed bumblebee, or this big obvious yellow moustache here, as we've got in the male of that same species. As I mentioned, males, 4 of the 8 common species have those yellow faces like this. So if you can see that it's got a big yellow moustache, that immediately narrows down your options straight away, which is really useful. If it's got an obviously hairy face as well, you can be pretty sure that it's a male straight off, and you can confirm that by looking at the legs, which I'll get onto. For a couple of species, face shape is quite useful, whether it's got a long, narrow face or a little round face. But there's only one species pair where you need to worry about that, and I'll talk about those when we get to the individual species. So legs, as I mentioned, another good way of telling whether or not you've got a queen or worker on the one hand, or a male or possibly a cuckoo on the other. Only females of those 19 social bumblebees will carry pollen loads. So if you've got a bee which has got this big blob of pollen on the hind leg, like any of these three, you can be happy straight away that it is either a queen or a worker of one of those social bumblebee species. You can ignore all of the males, all of the cuckoos, and just concentrate on those female options. The actual colour of the pollen doesn't tell you anything about the bee itself. It's purely related to what it's been foraging on. They're generally a mixture of orange to white, yellow, but occasionally, if they're foraging on something slightly more interesting, you'll see black pollen baskets or bright blue or bright pink or purple. If you see bumblebees foraging on poppies, it's really quite impressive. They come out looking really gothic with just black pollen all over them. If they aren't carrying pollen, then it gets a little bit more difficult because you need to look for the presence of that pollen basket on the hind leg. This down here is the theory of what we're actually looking for. In females of the social species, you've got this obvious pollen basket structure. You have the face of the leg itself smooth and shining, and we can zoom in on that and you can hopefully see there are no hairs or anything on the face of the leg here. It's almost reflective, it's so shiny, and you can see it's got long fringing hairs on either side in the diagram and possibly even in the picture. Males of the social species have a broadly similar sort of shape, but if we zoom in you can see there are some hairs on the face of the leg here. It's not anywhere near as dedicated as in the females of the same species. And then cuckoos are almost just normal legs. They aren't flattened hardly at all, and they've got far more obvious hairs all over them. So if we zoom in on those, this is the theory. The female social bumblebee with just this smooth hind leg with hairs on either side, but not on the face. Males of those social species have a little bit more hair on the faces and that kind of thing. And so if we put pictures, you can see polished mirror shine in the female, long fringing hairs on either side. The male, much less differentiated, some hair on the face of the leg. It's much more sort of a bushy, hairy leg in general. And then in the cuckoos, both the female and the male, much less flattened, much more obviously normal legs, and much more sort of even hairs all over. So if we look at those two, you can see nowhere near the same amount of fringing hair, very obvious large amounts of hair on the face of the leg itself in both the female and in the male here. So you can confirm that with the dark wings and that kind of thing that I talked about for the cuckoos. But if what you're looking at has got a really, really hairy hind leg, then cuckoos are your first port of call. Antennae, this is right down towards the bottom of the list because it's really quite difficult to see in the field to be conclusive about. It is basically counting the antennal sections. So females have 12 segmented antennae, males have 13 segmented antennae. Obviously, that's quite difficult to tell in the field, and hopefully you won't need to because you've seen whether or not it's got a moustache, you've seen whether or not it's got the hairy legs and that kind of thing. But if you're still not sure, you can try and count. You can do it from a decent photo. You could probably do it from this one. And if you've got a dead bee, you picked it off the side of the road or whatever, then obviously you can count them under a microscope or through a hand lens or whatever. Once you get your eye in for what the female bumblebees look like, which you will if you go out and look at them now, when you first start seeing males of those species, they will look slightly different because they've got those slightly longer antennae. Even though it's not much, it just gives them a slightly different appearance. They look a little bit more front heavy than the females of the same species, just because they've got those slightly longer antennae. It's not an ideal field character, that's why it's down the bottom of the list, but it is a useful confirmation if you can get it. And then really last on the list is behavior, and this is last because it's not conclusive. Bumblebees can show different behaviors for all different kinds of reasons, but certain castes and certain species groups have fairly characteristic behaviors that they do a lot more than do some of the others. So in particular, it's useful for separating the female social bumblebees, both the queens and the workers, from the male social bumblebees and the cuckoos of both sexes. So females of those social species, the ones that build nests, have got to bring back a lot of pollen, bring back a lot of nectar. They spend an awful lot of time working hard. They will be visiting flower, 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 collect the pollen, back to the nest, go back out again, flower, 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 flower. it's really difficult to keep up with them, to take photos of them, because they're just constantly working. Queens, as I mentioned, will do that sort of low zigzag lost contact lens sort of flight. They will investigate things. Workers won't. Males won't, with the possible exception of if the workers have lost where the nest is, they will try and look for it. But queens do an awful lot more of those sort of behaviours. And males and cuckoo bumblebees, by contrast, because they don't have any work to be doing, they aren't collecting pollen, collecting nectar or anything, they will spend an awful lot of time sat on flowers, not doing very much. Generally, I find the easiest way to tell is that if you can approach a bee on a flower and take an awful lot of pictures of it, just sat there as you change the angles and that kind of thing, it's very likely to be either a male or a cuckoo bumblebee, or in this case, both male and a cuckoo bumblebee. If you try and do that with a female of one of the social species, generally by the time you even got your camera out, it will have been off to the next flower, and it's really difficult to take that series of pictures. So if it's not doing anything, if it's just sat there, generally it's likely to be a male or a cuckoo, with the caveat that if it's cold, you'll get social bumblebees sat, queens and workers sat on flowers, not able to do very much until it warms up a bit or whatever. So it's not conclusive, but it is quite a useful guide of where to start. Now, moving into the species-specific ID, these are the big 8, the common and widespread bumblebees, the ones that will make up 95–99% of your bumblebee sightings. They're the ones that will come to you, essentially. You'll see them in parks and gardens and on farmland and that kind of thing. You don't have to go and look in specific habitats or specific sites for them. And we've got, as you can see, a couple of red-tail species, a ginger species, and the rest are white or whitish species. So we're going to go through them in the tail colour groups because that's the easiest way to split them up for ID purposes. You can split them up again by whether they're common, cuckoo, or scarce or rare. So we're going to look at these 8 in here. The rare or scarce species you probably aren't going to see. As I say, they're the species that you have to go to particular sites or particular areas to actually seek them out in order to see them. The cuckoos, which I picked out in red for the rest of today, are also widespread, but not abundant. So you might see them, and it is worth just keeping an eye out for cuckoos, but because they don't have the colony system and because they're parasitic, there are really low numbers of cuckoo bumblebees in the area compared to the number of the social individuals at any one time. So as I say, the vast majority of the sightings will be the ones that we're going to go through in detail now. We'll start with the ginger bumblebees, or the uniform-tailed bees, and there's only one common and widespread species. So generally this is a pretty straightforward species, because if you see a ginger bumblebee, and it's ginger all over, including on the abdomen, it will be this species, the common carder, Bombus pascorum. It's a relatively variable species in terms of the actual colour hue, colour tone, from brown, as we've got in the diagrams here, right the way up to a bright sort of Lucasade ginger. But it's always pretty much the same colour throughout. It doesn't have any distinction between the tail and the rest of the abdomen, although the abdomen can be relatively banded, as we've got here. It always has some black hairs on the abdomen. The amount of black hair does vary between individuals, from something like this right the way through to something that's a really dark form. But you can see it's still got this ginger at the back end. Even here, it's not a white tail. And it tends to have these pale sides to the thorax and ginger brown on top. Males are a little bit yellower, but generally it's fairly easy to get to the species with this one. And as you can see, it is found pretty much everywhere across Britain. These gaps are basically gaps where people haven't gone out to record bumblebees rather than there are no bumblebees. This gap in the middle here, for instance, is Northamptonshire. And it's not that bees don't live in Northamptonshire, it's just that until very recently there wasn't any county bee recorder and very few people in the area who specialised in bees or bumblebees. And so it's just that no one has sent in records from Northamptonshire rather than the bee isn't found there. So this is a very common species. It's a very long-tongued species. It's the one that you'll see feeding on foxgloves and in nasturtiums and on dead nettle in hedge bottoms and that kind of thing. And it is the only ginger or all ginger bumblebee that you're going to see on a regular basis. The red-tailed bumblebees are the next group. They are twice as difficult because there's two of them. We have the early bumblebee, that I've talked a little bit about already, and we have the red-tailed bumblebee, Bombus lapidarius. The early bumblebee is the first one of the two to appear. It is the only species, only of the common species, where workers and queens have both yellow bands and a red tail. So it's another one that you can be fairly happy on fairly quickly. Its other characteristic feature is that this red tail is very small and often quite pale. So it's this much more sort of orangey red rather than the big, obvious bright red. And it is generally only this last section or two of the abdomen which actually has those red hairs on. So it's actually easy to miss unless you see the bee from behind. But generally, well, it will have it. Queens have these two yellow bands, as I mentioned before. Workers often lose the abdominal band, but still have this yellow collar band and the red tail. And the males make up for that by having even more yellow than the queens do. So they have this big fluffy yellow collar band, which extends forward into a big obvious yellow moustache. They look really, really fluffy and really, really sort of lemon yellow. And they have this big yellow abdominal band before you get down to the red tail. By contrast, the red-tailed bumblebee, workers and queens don't have any yellow on them. So they don't have any of the yellow bands at all. So you can split those two very easily. Look at the tail. Is it red? It's one of these two. If it's got yellow bands, it's the early bumblebee. If it doesn't, if it's just this jet black all over, it is the red-tailed bumblebee. Males make that a little bit more difficult, but they don't have any yellow on the abdomen at all. You can see it's just a black abdomen down to the red tail. By contrast, in the early bumblebee, you've got this big, obvious yellow abdominal band and a red tail. So again, if it's got a red tail and a yellow band, it's a early bumblebee. If it doesn't have that yellow band on the abdomen, it is the red-tailed bumblebee. But it does still have this yellow moustache. It's got the yellow collar band and a little bit of yellow at the back of the thorax, just none on the abdomen itself. Queens and workers, very jet black, velvety in appearance, big, obvious red tail, a much deeper red and a much more extended tail. It's up to about half of the abdomen is this red tail in the queens and in the workers. And again, really quite distinctive species and one that you'll get to know pretty quickly. It's a really common species. The white-tailed bumblebees are where it gets a little bit trickier. We divide them up into the banding patterns as well as the tail groups because there are an awful lot of white-tailed bumblebees. 14 of our species have got white tails amongst the bumblebees. So we look at the tail colour and then you look at the banding pattern. And so these are the white-tailed bumblebees which have got two yellow bands. There are two common species which fit that description. You have the white-tailed bumblebee, which is actually three near identical species, but we treat them as one for the purposes of field ID because you can only identify them by using DNA, which is a bit beyond what we're going to do. And the buff-tailed bumblebee. So buff-tailed bumblebee, usually the first one that you'll see every year. The queens start flying in mid-February often. And queens are quite straightforward because queen buff-tailed bumblebees have a buff-coloured tail. You can see it's got this orangey buffy hue in the tail here. In the diagram, you can see that that colour is clearly not white. Workers, as we talked about, confuse that slightly because they lose most, if not all, of the buff in that tail. So they do sometimes show what we call the T-stain, this very, very thin yellowy band between the black of the abdomen and the white of the tail. If it's got that, you can be pretty happy that it is going to be a worker of the buff-tailed bumblebee. because the worker whitetail and some worker bufftails just have a pure white tail. So if it's only got a pure white tail, you can't tell between the two. If it's got some yellow in there, it's probably going to be the bufftail terrestris. Males look very, very similar to workers, including still apparently having pollen baskets and that kind of thing, although they didn't collect any. But they do generally show a lot more yellow in the tail. The tail colour is sort of intermediate between the queens and the workers. Male buff-tailed bumblebees also smell of feet. Bumblebee males produce pheromones in order to attract the females. And in species like the early bumblebee, they're quite nice and smell of citronella when you pick them up. But if your mystery bumblebee has really quite strong cheesy smell, it's quite likely to be a male buff-tailed bumblebee. So you want to be fairly certain that it is a male before you sniff it, but it is actually a really quite useful way of identifying bumblebees is by smell. And again, it's a really common species everywhere. It's extending further and further northwards. 15 years ago, it wasn't in northern Scotland at all. 5 years ago, when I did a training course in Thurso, it was the most abundant bumblebee that we found up there. It's now on the Orkneys as well and just turned up on the Outer Hebrides. It's a really, really abundant species, has really big nests with up to about 400 workers in. You'll see an awful lot of it. It is the sort of quintessential bumblebee, really. The other two-banded white-tailed species is Bombus leucorum, the white-tailed bumblebee. As I mentioned, this is actually three species. You have the cryptic white-tailed bumblebee, the northern white-tailed bumblebee, and the actual white-tailed bumblebee, but they are essentially identical on external features. You can only tell them apart if you look at the DNA or chemical composition of some of the pheromone secretions. So we lump them all together in terms of field ID. Queens, because the only real similar species is the buff-tailed bumblebee, you can rule them out or in by a process of elimination, because queens have this obvious snow white tail. It's completely white. There's no yellow hairs in there at all. And so if you've got a big bumblebee, which is clearly a queen by the size, and it's got this yellow collar band, yellow band across the middle of the abdomen, and this pure white tail, you can be pretty happy that it's going to be a white-tailed bumblebee rather than the buff-tail. Workers, as I say, it's virtually impossible to identify the white-tailed form of the buff-tailed bumblebee worker from the normal white-tailed bumblebee worker. So it's by far the safest just to lump them as buff-tail / white-tail worker for that. Males are relatively easy because they're another one of these species which have got a yellow face, a big yellow moustache in the males. And so quite fluffy, quite yellow. This is a sort of intermediate one where it's got a bit of yellow at the back, but it's still got this yellow band on the abdomen quite clearly. Still got this yellow collar band, which extends forward to this yellow moustache. Still got this white tail. So you can be pretty happy that it's going to be a white-tailed bumblebee male. This distribution map is really confused because it's the three species and we don't know quite which one was recorded in which place. We only realised that we had all three 20 or 30 years ago. But it is pretty common. In the lowland areas, it seems to actually be leucorum. You seem to get all three flying side by side in the upland areas when we've looked at the DNA. But basically, just treat them all as one. And it's the two-banded species with a pure white tail. And then generally males are the easiest group to find because they stand out with this yellow moustache. Late summer on bramble is a really good way to find them. The penultimate group are the white-tailed bumblebees which have got 3 or more yellow bands. The distinction between these and the last group is that these 3-banded species, they still have this yellow collar band behind the head, but they have this second band at the back of the thorax here, and this third band at the very front of the abdomen. So in the 2-banded species, you had a black band, then a yellow band, and then a black band. You don't get that pattern in the 3-banded species. It's just yellow at the very front, then a black patch, and then the tail. And you also have this second band at the back of the thorax, which if the bee is sat on a flower with its wings folded, it will actually stick up as a little mohican, little yellow mohican at the back of the thorax in a way that just doesn't happen with the two-banded species because they only have black hairs there. We've got two of these three-banded species. We have the garden bumblebee, which is quite big and has a very long face and is found pretty much everywhere. And we have the heath bumblebee, which is smaller and fluffier with a little round face and has this slightly more disjunct distribution. It doesn't seem to do very well in basically intensively farmed areas. So it doesn't do very well in the Midlands here. It does do quite well in acidic areas, which is why it's all over the south of England on the Cornwall moors and that kind of thing up to the Sussex heaths, Sussex and Surrey heathlands around here. And up into the Peak District, you can find it quite frequently. We'll start with the garden bumblebee. This is quite a big thing. It's similar in size to the buff-tailed bumblebee, but a little bit more slender. Males, workers and queens all have this same basic pattern with the yellow collar band, this yellow band at the back of the thorax, which as you can see is really quite distinctive when the bee's at rest because it sticks up above the wings here, whereas the wings cover any of the hair on the abdomen. So this yellow abdominal band doesn't stick up when the bee is at rest. And then a white tail down at the back end here. This is a very long-tongued species. It's the one that you'll see visiting foxgloves and nasturtiums and that kind of thing, but it will also visit open flowers, as we've got here. So it's worth just having a look at the face, if you can actually see it. It's got a really long face. It's got a really long tongue as well. So why it feeds on those deep flowers. And that is what distinguishes it from the heath bumblebee, Bombus janellus. This is a much smaller species. It's similar in size to the early bumblebee. It's quite closely related to the early bumblebee. And so it's small and it's fluffy. So even though it's got the same pattern with these three yellow bands, again, you can see that mohican at the back of the thorax there sticking up. It will never visit the deep flowers. You'll never see it on foxgloves and honeysuckle and that kind of thing because it just can't reach. It's only got a short tongue and short face. But you can see that it's got a little round face, if you can see that. It will also be visiting heather and those sort of short flowers rather more. If you get a close look, you can see that the hairs fringing the pollen basket, as we've got here, are pale. They're a sort of peachy orangey colour in the heath bumblebee, Janellus. If we go back to the garden bumblebee, you can see those hairs are black by comparison. So garden bumblebee is very straightforward, just black or yellow or white. The heath bumblebee has these peachy hairs. Generally, size is really quite a good way of splitting the two. Heath bumblebee is much, much smaller and fluffier than the garden bumblebee. But if you've only got a side view or you've only got a picture, these pollen baskets are quite handy, and the face length if you've got a head-on view. Males make it a little bit easier because male heath bumblebees have this yellow moustache, as you can see here. That's never present in the garden bumblebee. The garden bumblebee only ever has black hairs on its face, whether it's a male or a female of any kind. If it's got these three bands and it's got a yellow face, you can be pretty happy that it's going to be a heath bumblebee. As you can see, it is not going to be hugely close to the actual Heart of England forest site, but they are up in the upland areas and they're probably under recorded, particularly in those upland areas, but also the lowland heath down in the south and some of these coastal heathlands in Norfolk and Suffolk along here as well. And if you go up to northern Scotland and up in the mountains, it does really well. So if you're in acidic areas, upland areas, you've probably got both flying alongside each other. If you're in the lowland areas, particularly in the Midlands, you're very likely to only have garden bumblebee. But do just have a bit of a look if anything looks a bit funny. Our last group is, handily, pretty much the easiest bumblebee that we have to identify, because this is the tree bumblebee, Bombus hypnorum. It is the only British bumblebee species which has this sort of Neapolitan colour scheme where we've got this ginger sort of foxy brown on the thorax then a black abdomen, and then the white of the tail. Nothing else has that sort of 3-block pattern. And so it's nice and straightforward to identify. Really quite a common species nowadays. It's come a long way since it was first recorded in Britain in 2001, which was down just outside the New Forest, somewhere around here. And as you can see, it's now raced. I think it made it down to the tip of Land's End in about 2008, made it up to Scotland in 2013, is now north of Inverness. And we've had records coming in up around Golspie up here actually this year, so it doesn't seem to be slowing down at all. Made it over to Ireland a couple of years ago as well, and is now spreading out around Belfast. And really, really distinctive species. There's very little else that you could mistake it for. And the only possible real confusion species is a worn or quite dark form of the common carder, the first bee that we looked at, which is ginger all over. If that has a lot of black hair on the abdomen, it can sometimes look like this sort of pattern, but it never has that white tail that the tree bumblebee does. And this is the one that will come and live in your loft and in your shed and that kind of thing, in your bird boxes in the garden. Another way that you can tell it apart from Pascorum, the common carder, is that the sides of the thorax here are black. In the common carder, they're always pale. So it's quite different once you get your eye in for it. It does also produce melanic individuals really quite frequently. So you can see instead of having that ginger on the thorax, it's got an awful lot more black hairs in there. But it usually does that fairly incompletely. So you can see it's still got some ginger in the back here that you can see. And if you can get a decent view of it, you can usually see that there is still a lot of ginger in there. It's just hidden behind the black. And also you tend to find it flying around in company of a lot of bees that look like this. So again, you can be fairly confident. It's an interesting feature of melanism in bumblebees that it only mostly seems to actually go for the colour bands. You usually still get the tail colour, which isn't any different. So you still got that white tail. It's just that the ginger on the thorax is darker in this particular individual. So in terms of surveying for bees and identifying bees in the field, it's quite useful, as you can probably appreciate, to have a slightly closer look without the bee flying away. So a net of some sort is quite handy. Basically, anything sold as a butterfly net will be fine. Watkins and Doncaster sell an awful lot of decent stuff. But anything which is sold as a butterfly net will be fine, basically. As long as it's not a shrimping net with massive holes, then you should be fine. A hand lens of some sort is quite useful to be able to tell things like those hairs on the pollen baskets and hairs on the face, and just take a slightly closer look at those. You only need a really sort of times 10 hand lens. Anything more than that, and you struggle to get the right bit of bee in focus at any particular time. And either a sample tube, so you can put your bee in it, or we recommend these queen marker cages, which look like this. It's a tube of perspex with a grid across the end and this foam-covered plunger. You put your bee in there, as we've got in here, and then you can just constrain it rather more than you can in a normal tube. Bee in a normal tube like this obviously can go all over the place. It's very difficult to get the right bit in focus that you want to have a look at, which means it needs to spend more time in the tube and it doesn't do any good. If you have it in these queen marker pots, you can just reduce the amount of space that it has to buzz about in. You can gently press it up against the grid in order to be able to see the right bits without it moving too much. And that means that you can spend the minimum amount of time in the tube. You can check the ID features really quite quickly, and then you can let it go again. So you can buy these from beekeeping suppliers or Watkins and Doncaster again, or you can even get them on Amazon. They're sold as queen marker cages or queen marker tubes or pots or plunger pots or whatever. And an ID book is always quite handy. There are a lot of colour patterns in bumblebees. And we're very lucky nowadays that we have a range of books to choose from. We go back 10 or 15 years and there weren't any. The first came out in 2009 is this one. It's still quite good, but it does fall down slightly on letting you separate the more similar species pairs. So a few years ago now, we at the Bumblebee Conservation Trust wrote this book, Bumblebees, an Introduction, which is based on our experience delivering all of these training courses, sort of 40 a year for 10 years or something, seeing where people trip up on ID and trying to smooth out those bumps as far as we possibly can. So it's got a whole load of different photos of different casts of bees, different stages of wear and fading and that kind of thing. And also a lot of written text on how to separate different species apart from each other and that kind of thing. So I'm biased because I wrote it, but we do think it's a very good book. If you are taking specimens and want to key them out, then this Naturalist Handbook is very good. It has a nice user-friendly key. And if you want to look at bees in the broad sense, including all of the solitary bees and that kind of thing, as well as bumblebees, then Steve Falk's Field Guide to the Bees of Great Britain and Ireland is really the only game in town. It's a really, really good way to get into bees. But the field guide bit of the name is a bit of a misnomer, because when you get down to solitary bees, you need to look at really quite small details of punctuation on the exoskeleton of the bee and that kind of thing. So although it will certainly help you with bees in the field, there's only so far that you can go without looking down a microscope at them. And I've also put this one in, again, because I wrote it. I think it's a really nice introduction to the natural history of bees and enlarges on the stuff that we talked about before the break, essentially the life history of bees, what they do in the nest and what they forage on and that kind of thing. It's not an ID book, but it will hopefully be interesting once you've got into bees properly. So our last little bit, I think in Zoom, you've all got a hand up thing somewhere. So we can do this quiz, even though we are slightly separate. So all of these are going to be queens of the common species. Let me just check that I can actually see where any of the hand up things are. So otherwise we'll just skip past this bit if we can't make it work. So has anyone found a hand up button? I don't use them very much. Yes.
It's under the reactions button on my end, so that might help people.
Excellent, thanks. Yes, I can see people have got hands up there. I can ask them to lower hands. Okay. In that case, I will put up some pictures and give you a couple of options as we go through them, and put up your hands when you think I say the right one, and we'll have a rough idea of how many people were wrong or right. So this one is a queen bumblebee. These are all going to be queen bumblebees. So do we think that this is a buff-tailed bumblebee? I think we've got -1 on hands up there. How about a garden bumblebee? Still not very many hands. What about a white-tailed bumblebee? Oh, I've got a flood of hands by comparison. Yes, it is a white-tailed bumblebee queen. You can see it's got this pure, pristine snow white tail. We've got these 2 yellow bands. So it's not a buff-tailed bumblebee because it's got that white tail. So how about this one? Who thinks this might be the tree bumblebee? No one. How about the common carder bumblebee? No, we've got a lot of hands coming up there. Yeah, common carder. So ginger brown thorax, pale sides to the thorax, those gingery yellow hairs continuing all the way back to the tail here. Got some black hairs in there as well. So that is the common carder, Bombus pascorum. How about this one? Again, another queen. Who thinks this might be the red-tailed bumblebee, Bombus lapidarius? That hand going down then. How about the white-tailed bumblebee? Still no one. What about the early bumblebee, Bombus praetorum? Nope. What about then the buff-tailed bumblebee? It's a flood of hands. Excellent. Yeah, this is Bombus terrestris, the buff-tailed bumblebee. Again, got those two yellow bands, collar band behind the head, band across the middle of the thorax, but we've also got this obviously buff coloured tail here, which means, yeah, queen buff-tailed bumblebee, nice and straightforward. How about this one? Who reckons this might be the red-tailed bumblebee? We've got a couple of people who think it might be that, up to about 8 or so. How about the early bumblebee, Bombus praetorum? Still got a few hands going down there. This is, yeah, the red-tailed bumblebee, Bombus lapidarius. Got that big, obvious red tail here, and no other colours, just this jet black, velvety appearance all over. So that is the red-tailed bumblebee. Even showing you her pollen basket nicely here. How about this one? Who reckons this might be the buff-tailed bumblebee? We've got a couple of hands there, I think. How about the early bumblebee, Bombus praetorum? Oh, a lot more hands. And how about the, what's the other one? The red-tailed bumblebee. So got a few hands up, but I think mostly they're going down. This is the early bumblebee. This is the queen, so she's only got this small orangey red tail, and then she's got these two yellow bands as well. So nice and distinctive as a queen, quite small, quite neat bumblebee. How about this one then? Who reckons this might be the white-tailed bumblebee? Pretty much no one. How about the garden bumblebee? Yeah, a few more hands. How about the heath bumblebee? A few different hands there. So this is actually the garden bumblebee. This is a queen garden bumblebee. So she's got the white tail. So we can rule out all of the red tailed and all of the uniform tail species. Then we've got 1, 2, 3 yellow bands. So it takes us to either the garden bumblebee or the heath bumblebee. You can see the sticking up of the wings nicely. And then we've got this extra shot to show that she's got this long face. So you can see the face is much longer than it is wide. You can also see here that it's feeding on a very long flower, even though you can't see her tongue. So this is the garden bumblebee rather than the heath bumblebee. This is Bombus hortorum. So we've just got a couple more. As it said there, these are going to be the workers and or males, still only of the common species, but because we're getting a little bit later in the year now, a lot of the queens have gone or tucked themselves up in the nest, and what we're seeing mostly are the workers, and the males are just starting to appear. So same process for these. First of all, do we think this is a male bumblebee? Hands up for males. None. How about a female bumblebee? Yeah, lots of hands. So yeah, you can see it's got pollen in the pollen basket, which is a definite clue as to what we've got there. So as to species, now that we know this is a female and thus a worker, do we think this is a red-tailed bumblebee? I've got one hand maybe. Or a buff-tailed bumblebee? Hand's gone down, one hand's gone up. Or the early bumblebee. Couple of hands. This is a worker early bumblebee. So we saw the pollen in the pollen basket there, so we knew it was a worker. We can see that it's got this little sort of excuse of a washed out tail here, but it is clearly orangey red rather than being white. And then we've got this yellow band at the front. So the red-tailed bumblebee wouldn't have any bands there. The buff tail, although the colour of the tail might not be hugely different, it would usually be whiter in the worker. and it would also have another yellow abdominal band. This is a fairly dark form of the early bumblebee worker. How about this one? First of all, do we think it's a worker? Hands up for worker. Or a male? Hands up for male. A few more. Yeah, although this isn't the best angle to see the pollen basket, you can see that it's got this yellow face here. So we know that it's a male of one of those 4 species. So do we think this is a heath bumblebee? First of all hands going down. How about a white-tailed bumblebee? Still hands staying down. How about the early bumblebee? No one committing. Or a male red-tailed bumblebee? Yeah, loads of hands. Yeah, this is the male red-tailed bumblebee. So the 4 that I went through are the 4 that have that yellow face, that yellow moustache. Obviously, we can rule out the heath and the white-tail because it's got a red tail. And then we can rule out the early bumblebee because it doesn't have any yellow on the abdomen. It's just got a black abdomen and a red tail. Nice big obvious red tail as well. So this is the red tail bumblebee, Bombus lapidarius. Last couple now. Do we think this one is a male bumblebee? Hands up for male. Oh, I went down, but now we're going back up. Who thinks this one might be a worker bumblebee? Definitely less people. Yeah, this is a male bumblebee. You can see the hind leg here is obviously not smooth and shiny. You've got these hairs down the face. So this is a male bumblebee. Who wants to hazard a guess as to species? Who thinks this might be the garden bumblebee? No one by the look of it. That's good because it's got no band at the back of the thorax. Who thinks this might be a buff-tailed bumblebee? A few upvotes there. Who thinks this might be the white-tailed bumblebee? Slightly fewer people. This one is actually a buff-tailed bumblebee. It's very, very similar, obviously, between the 2 buff-tailed and white-tailed bumblebees. Both got these 2 yellow bands, both got the white tail, but you can see this yellow shadow in here, the T-stain. And so that makes it pretty likely to be the buff-tailed bumblebee. And we already looked at it was a male because we've looked at those hairy hind legs there. So I think this one is our penultimate one now, actually. Who thinks this is a worker bumblebee? Not many people. We've got a couple of hands there. Who thinks this is a male bumblebee? Slightly more hands. Yeah, this is a male. You can hopefully see that they've got a lot of hairs down the hind leg here. It's also quite fluffy in general, quite yellowish. And if you've got a particularly big screen, you might even be able to count the antennal section from that picture. So this is a male bumblebee. Who thinks it might be the common carder bumblebee? Got a few hands going up there, quite a lot of hands. Who thinks this might be the tree bumblebee? Got a lot of hands going down all of a sudden. Yeah, this is the common carder. This is a male common carder, so it's a bit more yellowy than the female, but the same basic pattern. Still got this ginger brown thorax, still got the pale sides to the thorax. Ginger and yellow and black hairs all mixed on the abdomen here, all the way down to the tail tip. So nice and distinctive species generally. Now, this is our last one, so we'll go straight to species with this one. Who thinks this might be a common carder bumblebee? Who thinks this might be a tree bumblebee, perhaps? A couple of hands there. Who thinks differently if it turns around. So this is actually a hoverfly. In this case, it's greater bulbfly, Meridon equestris. It's always worth just remembering as you go through that actually it's very easy to get fixed into thinking that everything is a bumblebee because that's what you're looking for. In actual fact, some of these will appear and some of the time they will catch you out. And some of the reasons why you can't identify it species or it doesn't seem to fit very well is because it's not actually a bumblebee. And sometimes when they're like that, it's very difficult to tell. But hopefully when it turns around, when you can see the whole thing, particularly when you can see it's got these stupidly massive eyes, funny stumpy little antennae, it is always worth just checking that what you've got is actually a bumblebee and not something else, no matter how much it may want to persuade you that it is a bumblebee. So that is it from me. And we've just got time for a few questions if anyone has any.